Seems like there's an expectation that we're going to start now. That's excellent. So I'm Katie Lloyd-Thomas, and today I've got my EDI committee hat on, and the EDI committee works around making change concerning equality, diversity and inclusion in School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. Really pleased to welcome you all here to tonight's talk in the Intersection series, and I especially want to welcome the group from the Root Labs Academy. It's brilliant to have you here, so lovely to see you. So the talk is called Changing the Way We Think, Talk and Do Disability in Architecture, and I'm especially pleased to introduce you to our wonderful speakers, Thea Chambers and Josh Boyd. We're very lucky to have both these leading figures in architecture and disability with us today. Their work's been very important to me in shaping my own ideas about disability. And before I tell you a bit more about Joss and Thea, I'd also like to say something about how tonight's lecture came about. So together with members of the EDI committee, especially Ruth Rayner, Tim Townsend and Sadaf Hussaini Tabatabe, we wanted to mark some dates in the calendar which represented issues that we're concerned with. And tomorrow, March the 1st, is International Wheelchair Day, which is an annual day of events and activities which take place around the world when wheelchair users celebrate the positive impact the wheelchair has had on their lives. Also recognise the people who make efforts to make this a better and more accessible place for people with mobility issues. They also recognise the fact and react constructively that there are many tens of millions of people in the world who need a wheelchair but aren't able to acquire one. Joss and Thea are going to talk much more broadly, I think, about disability, recognising that disabled people are a diverse constituency. They're going to explore how we can reimagine disability, access and inclusion in much richer and enjoyable ways that go beyond compliance by opening up alternative languages and practices for designers. And we really, with Thea, we really have one of the most sort of innovative designers in this field. So Thea's a co-founder of the award-winning architectural practice, Chambers McMillan Architects, based in Edinburgh. They specialise in accessible architecture designed to meet clients' individual needs. Architecture for all, inclusive, barrier-free and participatory. They put clients at the heart of their design process and have developed numerous forms of creative workshops that allow clients, children, young people, both to communicate their spatial needs, and also to imagine how they want the spaces to be experienced in a sensory way. Thea's also an architectural educator and much in demand around her specialisms with accessibility and design participation. The spaces Chambers McMillan design are careful, imaginative and joyful, you'll find out. They include numerous house renovations which enable inclusive life for families with disabled members. Also new builds such as the Rings accessible holiday cottages and the Ramp House, which was built to enable Thea's daughter, a wheelchair user, to lead a barrier-free included life, while at the same time providing equality of space for the whole family. As you'll see in Thea's talk, putting the ramp at the centre of the house creates an astonishing range of spatial experiences and opportunities for living in new ways. And Thea's daughter, who's now 19, is a widely exhibited artist and filmmaker who uses eye gaze technology to make her work, and I'm really excited because Thea's going to talk a bit about that as well with us tonight. So, Joss Boyd is a co-founder and co-director with Zoe Partington of the UK-based This Ordinary Architecture Project, which brings disabled artists into the built environment, education and practice to critically and creatively rethink access and inclusion. I've taken part in some of their events, and I also had the privilege to teach here at Newcastle undergraduate architecture students with the artist Naomi Lackmeyer as part of their project. Their work is transformative and internationally renowned. Joss has written some great books on the subject: Doing Disability Differently, Disability Space Architecture, a reader, one that I haven't read yet about neurodivergence in architecture, and I really urge you to read them. She's, I think, also going to talk about the new compendium today. Joss has also been a journalist, researcher, consultant, educator and photographer, and some of you will know her as well for her work with the feminist design cooperative Matrix. She was one of the authors of their recently published book, Making Space, Women in the Man-Made Environment, and curated a very popular exhibition at the Barbican about the practice called How Weird Now, which has been touring in various formats around the world, most recently in Melbourne, Australia, last year here with the Farrell Centre at Newcastle Contemporary Art, and apparently in Leeds as we speak, or elements of it.
Elements in Leeds, yes.
I wanted to say also, because I've got this chance with a room full of people, that I've known both Thea and Joss for many years, and that in addition to the work they do, they are both role models for how to live life. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Joss first, I think.
So the way we're planning this, and I'm going to wander about a bit, and I hope that's not going to be a problem with the microphone. We're talking sort of to the same theme, so this title is a shared title, but we'll talk about it in different ways, and I'm starting. And then, because we haven't seen each other's presentations, we'll have a brief chat with each other. We're planning to talk about 25 minutes each, and then a brief chat, and then we'll open up for questions and more discussion. So, changing the way we think, talk, and do disability in architecture, I think it's something both Thea and I share, as does Katie, which is we're very stuck in a kind of world within architecture of compliance with the regulations. Thinking about disability in its widest sense, creatively and not just functional access, is something that doesn't come up very much. Certainly something you don't tend to learn at undergraduate, seen as being a restriction on what you do, as a limit. And we want to say the point of disordinary architecture really is that we say human diversity and natural diversity, our bio and neurodiversity is a creative generator. It's actually something really valuable. It's not something we should somehow be turning into these artificial binaries of able-bodied and disabled. So the Disordinary Architecture Project is started in about 2008. It's a kind of informal platform. We work project by project. We have this mission statement, which my eyesight isn't very good, so I may not be able to read it, but you probably can, even though I know it well. To promote activity that develops and captures models of new practice for the built environment, led by the creativity and experiences of disabled artists. And the reasons we wanted to work with artists, Zoe Partington is herself a disabled artist, is that at that time, and still now really, if you are disabled, unless you have a really visible disability, then in architecture you tend to try and pass or mask, because it's really going to work against you in terms of your likelihood of employment and also in terms of how you get treated at architecture school. If you have a visible disability, a whole set of other factors come into play. So we have a practice, we have a world of practice and a discipline which ignores the many disabled people that are already in it, let alone how it works with disabled people and how it thinks about diverse disabled people beyond it. So we're really interested in that whole sphere. We now work a lot more with more disabled architecture students, but at the time we started, we brought artists in because it was a way of bringing in creativity, disabled creativity, into a world that didn't really think that disabled people could be creative. And that's because, and I don't know how many people here are in the world of the built environment, but we still treat disability in this incredibly limited way. We see it around functional access. We have these templates that we add on at the end of a project, so we design for normal people, and then right at the end, we add on bits and pieces for all the people we've already excluded, which is a kind of really odd way to work. And it's so embedded in the way that practice works, it's really hard to shift it. And one of the things we've started to do in Disordinary, we work in a whole range of different ways, but is to think about the language we use, the concepts we use, the terminologies we use. So these two disabled artists, unfortunately, Catherine Arinello is no longer with us, but Aaron Williamson, who's a deaf artist, they ran this thing called Disabled Avant-Garde Today. And the idea of the Disabled Avant-Garde was, it was a kind of running joke. They made loads of little films. It was a running joke that if you were disabled, you couldn't possibly be avant-garde. So we've always thought about it as being, what is it you need to do to make disability, access and inclusion something that's really cool to do? I mean, that's how things get into the mainstream. They start by being cool. And it's so not cool, do you know what I mean? It's so not, it's politically correct, it's earnest. It's like nobody wants to have anything to do with it. Some of my best friends still think that I do. They think, oh God, she's become an access consultant. So one of the things that I want to talk about in this session, I'll just talk about one part of what we do, and we have produced. I'm going to show it to you because I'm still very proud of it. We call it a catalogue or a compendium. It's called Many More Parts Than M, Reimagining Disability Inclusion and Access Beyond Compliance. And the idea of producing it, there's only that's like the last 2 copies, physical copies, but you can see it online on our website. I'll talk about that, how you access it later. We're looking for people to print more copies, but just mentioning that. The aim is to really try and raise a whole set of, just change the language, change the way we think about disability access and inclusion. This is the acknowledgements page, and I wanted to start with that because we couldn't do this if there weren't a huge number of disabled artists, scholars, activists across the world already producing the most amazing rethinking of access, really creative, really lively, beginning to use really different ideas and concepts. And this book could not exist without them. It's really an introduction to that work, because if you work in mainstream architecture or study mainstream architecture, you never hear about any of that. And it's quite, you may not find it. So this is like saying, hey, out there's this amazing stuff that you might find really enjoyable to read. And so it's an introduction to those people. And speaking as a non-disabled person, part of what I want to do is honour the amount of work and effort that goes on and act as a conduit with some opinions, but towards bringing that into our discipline. So rather than, a lot of stuff around access is done either by disability group. Are these blurry, or is it just my eyesight that makes them blurry? They're blurry? No? It's my eyesight. Usually you get it's like, this is what blind people need, this is what people who use wheelchairs, this is people who are deaf. And it doesn't in any way allow you to think about the intersections between those different groups, the things that actually, certain forms of access that work across different groups, and many forms of access which actually end up being quite contradictory, both within an impairment group or across it. So the complexity of that just gets ignored, and we're really interested in that complexity and how that's a creative opportunity for it's not a problem. So we wanted to, and the other thing we didn't want to do is like have standard things like wayfinding and the standard, the sets of devices that we already know and the language we use around that. So we tried to use introduce a range of terms. There's things like crypt time, which I'll talk about a bit. There's beauty, there's beyond the visual, ways of being. We wanted to introduce a whole different way of kind of thinking about how you might divide this up, and it's just done chronologically. So I'm going to just talk about 4 of these terms, very briefly, using work from Disorderly to kind of help explain what they are, and then Thea will refer back to these terms, but in her own way. And I'm just going to take a breath. Access ecologies is one of my favourite. It was invented by somebody called Kevin Gotkin, who's a really interesting US-based disability activist. And the whole point of access ecologies is access is a system. We all have access needs. It's not like disabled people have access needs and then non-disabled people don't have any. It's that the built environment we have is designed to make the access needs of normal people completely invisible, because they're met in everyday life. They just exist, so you can forget about them. And the idea of access ecologies is we need to look at that whole set of relationships, the whole range of different ways that we might understand what our access needs are, and also how some people's needs are met and not others. This is where my eyesight's, I might have to go much nearer the screen. Not that easy to read a quote, so I'm going to read it out. You can just shut your eyes and listen to me if you want, so you don't have to kind of have lots of things going on at once. So this is from Kevin Gotkin's piece, which is called Score for X, which is about this idea of access ecologies. Ask yourself for clarity. For a while, I thought I was writing a score for access integration. This could be a way to respond to cultural institutions wondering how they could build access practices into their organisations. But then I was like, no, because access could better be thought as an ecology, as more of ecology than a discrete set of tools that need to be integrated into some larger thing. Actually, the very idea that questions of access are somehow specific to considerations of disability emerges from a legislative tradition that centres compliance and liability in the public notions of the word accessibility. But access just is. I don't think there is any space that doesn't have access, but there are certainly spaces whose access ecologies severely limit possibilities for engagement. There are spaces, so many spaces, whose access ecologies are designed by ableism. And for me, that's a really powerful way of rethinking how we disability. And one of the ways that we do that in Disordinary is that we think about how do you notice those things. So you notice them when the access needs are shifted. So this is around gender. There's always a queue outside public women's toilets. And that's always seen as being like, oh, well, there we go, that's what it is. That's the nature of the world. Huh? This is at Gatwick Airport. I don't know why it happened, but there was a queue for the gents, a long queue for the gents. Men have never, this is not something they experience all the time. They had no idea what to do with themselves in that queue. They didn't know how to behave. They'd never queued to go to the toilet. Every single woman, oh, I'm losing my voice. Every single woman who came by with no queue laughed like a drain. And then here's something, so that's about where suddenly things get out of joint. Here's one that I really like, which is what in disability terms is often called a life hack. So here is an older woman, she's not got anywhere to sit down, so she reappropriates a bike rack, we'll see another example of this, for her own end. She appropriates something that has been designed. We know that the majority of cyclists are men, young men. She appropriates something that's actually ended up prioritising another group. But it's also true that thinking about these access ecologies can make you think about things in a much more adaptive and low-key way. Like, if access is everywhere, it's not like, oh my God, we've got to build a ramp here, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, with these kind of add-ons. It's much more, this was a project we did in London Park, something called Seats at the Table. I'll talk about it again. It's just an incredibly straightforward access addition. Didn't cost much money, very easy to put in. And that kind of ease of just meeting different access needs and seeing it as something that's additive, that's various, that's multiple, and they often have to be what we call rather pompously multimodal. There must be lots of different possibilities for different people. And as part of that same the work we did in the park, this is a piece about just adding a kind of sensory quality, which also is an orientation. It allows people, particularly people who are blind and visually impaired, to have orientation in a space, to know where they are, and to have something that's very tactile. And as part of that same project, another group looked at just how you might have access information up front that was both informative, it was stuff you needed to know, but it was also provocative, also raised questions. And this project, this is a Disordinary project, which we did in Germany, in Hanover, last year. Just used ideas, positive ideas of deaf game and deaf space as a way of making a very lively and engaging temporary platform for a festival. With lots of different elements in it, including like a dancing platform that vibrated, so that if you were deaf, you had a vibration platform. I'm not going to talk about it much more because I don't have much time. So term number 2, which we use a lot in Disordinary, because it really helps get at some of these things. If access ecology is about like thinking about it in terms of systems, misfitting, fitting and misfitting is thinking about it in terms of everybody's everyday life, and in terms of thinking of access as something that's it's relational. It depends. Your access needs to be met in certain circumstances and not others. It depends who you're encountering, it depends what the space is like, it depends what the objects are like. So it's not a fixed functional issue that can be sort of defined in the regulations. It's actually really variable. And fitting and misfitting comes from another disability study scholar called Rosemary Garland Thompson, who writes about this idea that if you fit, the thing about fitting is actually it's a problem. When you fit and how you fit, and all of us will probably fit in some places and not others, but when you fit, you don't even notice that you're fitting, sort of saying that to psychologists. Having a body-mind that fits smoothly with its immediate material and social environment results in a lack of taking notice of surroundings and assumptions of your own unproblematic place in the world. So if you fit your own, I'm going to use the word privilege, although there's a lot of issues around that, but your own privilege is invisible to you. So fitting is actually a problem, and we would say that fitting, misfitting can be a real problem because you're facing barriers and challenges all the time. That's not just around physical access, it may be being the only person of colour in a room full of white people. There's lots of different ways in which you might misfit. But it means that you have to increase you're paying so much attention to things and you're negotiating, all the time you're negotiating place and encounters, that's actually a very creative place to be, and that if we build off that creativity as designers, for example, we've got a lot to work with in a way that fitting smoothly doesn't. So we're very interested in Disordinary about alternative forms of fit. How can you shift the notion of what fits and what doesn't fit? This is Liz Crow, one of the disabled artists we work with a lot, and she did a project back in 2017 with the University of Westminster with students there, which was called Tilted Horizons. And it was about the fact that as somebody with a chronic condition, that if she, things have changed slightly, I'm not sure they have, lying down in public has always been a problem for her because people assume she's homeless or drunk, or they just don't think it's tidy, and they move her on. So we were looking at with the students about how you might find places to lie down. What would those places be like? What are the conditions? How could you make them? How could you adapt places to have places of rest? What would a city look like that allowed people to rest easily? And so the students just did very quick work like this, and then they made they did a project around it. And Liz also was making work about not hiding when she needed to rest and recover by being in her private home and kind of performing like she was fine in public. She started taking her bed out into the public realm, made art projects about it, but this is her doing her masters, and she took her bed into the seminar spaces. And what everybody said is it completely shifted the nature of those seminar spaces. Everybody was much more, it opened up people. It was like people were able to express their vulnerabilities much more because it was a kind of, it was like she was just showing that possibility. Some other things around fitting and misfitting. This is an artist called Dave Dixon who has a prosthetic leg, as you will see. And he's really interested in the fact that people either see him as a cyborg and a superhero, or they see him as somebody to feel rather sorry for. And he's just interested in how having a prosthetic leg changes his relationship to the world. And so he does projects around getting people to change their bodies and then exploring, often through drawing, what that might mean, that might be a creative difference, not something that's either better or worse. This was in Copenhagen at the Royal Danish Academy also, 2018-19. And this is Naomi Lackmeyer, who Katie mentioned. This was also in Copenhagen. She does a project called Bodies in Relation, which is about what happens if we start treating space as something where all our bodies are completely interdependent. We have to look at how we might care and support each other, and using that both as a metaphor and as a real kind of way of actually working and a way of designing that involves interdependence. This is a project, I didn't really mean to end up saying this is a project and this is a project, but clearly I am. This is another project for Theatre Foreman in Germany, this time in Braunschweig. That's the architects team, 2 deaf architects involved, and we worked with a lot of deaf and disabled artists in Germany and did workshops and co-designed the space. So part of this is also about how you work around concepts of misfitting to actually co-create something that enables a range of different ways of being in the space. This was again around the idea of desk space, around the idea that that people who sign naturally form a kind of circle, that it's a very social, a very performative way of being. It's rather wonderful. And this was the pavilion that was designed out of that. And then there was this terrible concrete bench that all of us hated, and so we just put which nobody ever sat on, so we just put these sort of extra chairs on it, and it became occupied immediately. And this goes back to the bike rack for the deaf and blind and partially sighted people involved in this project. Being in a public shared space that was with lots of bicycles was actually really problematic. If you're deaf, you can't hear them. If you're blind and partially sighted, you can't see them. And not all, but some cyclists act as if even other humans will get out of the way. So we deliberately claimed all of the bike racks during the festival as seating. And then, just to push it a bit further, I'm still probably most proud of this project. This is called Architecture Beyond Sight. And it's done in collaboration with the Bartlett School of Architecture. It's sort of still going, although they've run out of money for us. So it's thinking about the disciplines. The other things I've been talking about actual built space. This is about what happens when you try and change, when you think about not just like somehow inviting more blind and partially sighted people into architecture, but not changing anything, and actually saying, what does it mean? How might you design in a way that goes beyond the visual? What might all the different ways of designing, different modelling techniques, using audio description, what are the whole range of tools that you might gain by starting in a non-visual way? This is Carlos Pereira, who is a blind architect in Portugal, who helped us out. This is some students' work, somebody completely blind, who did an imaginary project in her head, because that's what she wanted, is a space in her head. This is Mandy Redrose-Rowe, who's a blind theatre producer, writer and actor, with Charlotte Abdul, who's a sighted architect, working together, looking at how you might co-design. And they designed this space together, and then they performed the space. They spoke to it, they walked around it, they explained where things were. And it was completely gorgeous. And then this is some of the students probably doing working in the workshop, so we did a lot of work around making the workshop more accessible and attitudes changing. This is Duncan Murding on the left-hand side, who's a blind furniture maker from Tasmania. And Poppy Lennerson, working with him, has just finished her architecture course at UAL, I think, and that was the project she did with us. And again, things change. So the view, the crits of the work, this one, they just became under the table rather than on the table or on the wall. They shifted their nature, which I think is really nice. Okay, term number 3, crypt time. I will get through this one quite quickly. I really like crypt times. The idea of crypt time is, architecture, we think about space, we may think about movement, we don't necessarily think about time, and people's understanding of time and experience of time is very variable, and for people who are disabled, I'm going to read a rather long quote, apologies. This is from Alison Kafer, who's written a great book called Feminist Queer Crip that I recommend anybody read. The need for extra time, that means like how crypt time might be thought, might result from a slower gait, dependency on attendants who might themselves be running late, malfunctioning equipment from wheelchairs to hearing aids, a bus driver who refuses to stop for a disabled passenger, or an ableist encounter with a stranger that throws one off schedule. Operating on crypt time then might be not only about a slower speed of movement, but also about ableist barriers over which one has little or no control. So the idea of crypt time is that it is quite political. It's a way of seeing that the time that people have is also not just how they understand time or how much time things take, but it's also about who has what kinds of responsibilities, who has what kinds of barriers. It might be caring for another adult. It might be that you have to work, you need to work as a student because you need the money. And that really affects how you can perform on a course. And that would be crypt time. But it also has a very straightforward understanding, which is about just making more places in the world to rest. I was talking about that with Liz. This is a piece by Helen Stratford, who is a disabled architect, and Raquel Mezague, who is a disabled artist, which just made a very simple kind of canopy and beanbag structure as a place to rest, with kind of quotes on it from people. This is from Raquel: "If I don't rest in public, my world gets very small." To just kind of think about, so just this is one small aspect, think about rest as something that we all deserve. And I added in a quote from Tricia Hersey from Rest is Resistance: "Our worth does not reside in how much we produce, especially not for a system which exploits and dehumanises us. Rest in its simplest form becomes an act of resistance and a reclaiming of power because it asserts our most basic humanity. We are enough. The systems cannot have us." So for me, all these terms, you can see, have a political dimension. They are actually about refusing to fit the norms and the requirements of the kind of capitalist system that we currently work in. You may not agree with that, but that's the position I come from. And that really leads to the last one, which is disability justice. You might think about this differently. Sorry to sit behind you. There's not enough room at the front. We talk about accessing, so I would call that social, spatial and material justice if I was being a pretentious architectural person. We talk about access and inclusion. What does access and inclusion mean? It means I'm fine, I'm not disabled, I'm here, I'm normal. Over there are the people I'm giving them access, I'm including them. They can come and join me, I'm going to help them come and join me, I'm going to give them empathy, love, caring. They're going to come over here with me. And for me, that's kind of bollocks, because what you actually have to do is say the normality that I represent is the problem, and that what we have to do is shift that normality. And it's a justice issue. It's not a kind of, oh, come over here thing that's really deeply embedded and problematic in the way that neoliberal societies deal with non-normative groups. So disability justice is a word that comes from a group. It comes from mainly people of colour in the States. Sins Invalid is a really brilliant, I don't know how to describe them, kind of activist theatre company. And they produce this thing called the Disability Justice Primer. It's got 10 principles, and it's in the book. But it's this idea that it is based, what does it mean to think about these things as an issue of justice? What are the kind of principles? They are so different from the inclusive design principles. So for me, they're very rich. And the way that they think in this very creative way is truly wonderful. There's also many artists working here critiquing what we're living in the UK. We're living in a circumstance where disabled people are being demonised all the time. They're having their benefits cut. The language of kind of, oh, they're all lazy, they're all just, they ought to be in work and they're not. They're they're using our taxpayers' money, is really like the government's just kind of trying to see how far it can push it. And it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous, not just for disabled people. Actually, I don't think we will talk about this. I'll just show you the pictures, because you've probably heard me speaking enough. This is just about how, for us, disability justice involves co-creation and co-design. So we worked with Seats at the Table. We worked with school kids, both disabled and non-disabled, to design these seats, very different kinds of seats. They did various projects to then combine together to make a series of 6 chairs. We used that as a place to have events and discussions and workshops, and that became the seedbed of many more parts than them. So the funding that we got was to take that work and then look at how you might extend and expand it. If you want to look at the compendium, the website is where you'll find it. You can see it on the top menu bar. It says compendium. I don't know why we called it compendium. We just did, and then we got stuck with it. It might be a catalogue, it might be an encyclopedia. I don't know quite what it is. It needs more work, but you can find. Oh, I've got another slide. You can find, if you go to the compendium site, you can find it as a downloadable PDF. You can find it as a flipbook in issue. You can find a screen readable version with all text. And you can find various other supporting videos that we made in connection, so with the idea that you might have different ways that you want to access it. And I think that's me done. Sorry, Thea, I might have gone on a bit.
No, it's fine. Really interesting. Thank you. Having not seen this presentation before, I can see how it connects really well with mine. Someone help me find the YouTube. It's on. Can you give me a hand to find the bit on the computer? Thank you. Do I just close? There you go. That one, brilliant. Yeah, but I want the YouTube. So quite often I do these talks with my now 19-year-old daughter Greta, but evenings are hard and travel's not always straightforward, and we live in Edinburgh, so she's going to, with the thought of disability justice, one of her favourite words is agency, and taking that agency, she's going to present herself a little bit. I'll just play about 5 minutes of this film, which gives a kind of overview of what she does. So let's see if I can get it. Is that going to start at the beginning?
My name is Greta and I use an add-ons communicator. I live in Edinburgh. Okay, with my art, it's important to me. And I shall put my eyes. I live in the round house. I help my mum and dad design it. It's important to me that we all move around it the same way.
So we live in the round house. We designed the round house as a family. The concept is that you move through different levels using the ramp, raised wheelchairs. So that means that it's a very inclusive space that everyone uses in the same way. We worked a lot with models so that you could imagine the space as it would be, and we found the models work really well. It was probably the first real collaboration that we did. So, Greta, you use your eye gaze to communicate with, and you can see there's a special part here which can see where you're looking, and that means that your eyes become like the cursor. One of the main softwares is your communication software. And what we usually do is that, because obviously Greta, you think in full sentence.
We spent the day telling sensory symposium. Lots of very interesting people spoke about making inclusive feedback. Symposium was introduced by Corey, who uses a communicator to speak to. Our lovely friend Eva came all the way from Sweden. We will see her in Sweden in the summer. I did my presentation about my art. I was a bit nervous, but it went really well.
So that was Greta using the story page. But one page that's really useful is the That's It page, which has That's It. It allows Greta, if she is editing a film, if she is making a decision about screenwriting, then we can look at lots of different possibilities. So over time we've come up with a way of scaffolding your communication and so your creative thinking, so that we enable you to express lots of thoughts and to make decisions about what you want to do creatively. It's still something we're working on, and having done the film summer school, we can see lots of potential, but we're at the beginning of how we can independently make films. But it's great because we're at the beginning and we can see the potential, exactly how you will do that. And in the meantime, we really enjoy working as a team, and at every opportunity you take control of the decisions and the command.
Hey, you have an hour this week, right? Yeah. Great. I can teach you how to play 100 songs on piano in an hour. No way. All you need to learn is 4 chords. These. 1, 2, 3.
There's only a couple more minutes of this that we're going to watch. I thought it was less me speaking and more Greta speaking. Right.
Let me tell you more about my art. This is a vinyl we made with my painting and stuck on the wall. It's my favourite, and I think it's quiet and loud.
she'd done the metalwork. So that just gives a little flavour.
Oh yes, why not? Homework was
It gives a little flavour of some of the things Greta's doing. It was far too much of me talking because it's quite a long film. I hadn't realised that there wasn't enough of Greta. But if you go on her YouTube, Greta Raffi McMillan YouTube, you could see she's doing lots of creative things. All of the music that you could hear, she plays with her eye gaze, with a special app, and working with Drake Music Scotland. And the paintings, obviously, she's doing with her eyes. And she's now doing filmmaking. Probably not got time today to look at the filmmaking short documentary, but check her out on YouTube. But that just gives you a sense of who Greta is. And now, how do I make this into a signature? That one. That's the last one though. Is there a way of quickly getting back to the beginning on this? I already don't like PCs. Never use them if that's not important. Right, so I click on that. Is that full screen? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you about our experience of designing inclusively with our daughter Greta, who's now 19 and is a wheelchair user. And then I'm going, if I have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we've been working on with the Yard Dundee, which is an inclusive outdoor, indoor play centre, and looking at the creative workshops that we've done with them. So as a family with a wheelchair user, we often experience the everyday barriers of our built environment, but we also like to look for places that feel more inclusively designed. So this is Copenhagen. I think quite often when bikes are involved in cities, so in Netherlands, in Scandi countries, quite a lot of public spaces feel more accessible to wheelchair users because they're thinking about the wheeling aspect of it. I also think that children learn spaces by experiencing them. So my research has been looking at how children understand, use, and then potentially create spaces differently. I think as a family we've had a very different experience because everywhere we visit we've come up against the barriers, but we've also looked at different ways of experiencing them. So this is B, our older daughter, and then you can see Greta's right at the top there, obviously not able to experience this wonderful Peter Zumthor building in Bregenz, but so I think we've kind of spent quite a lot of time exploring spaces, and I observe how both kids use them and the differences then between, you can see the kind of pure joy in B there, she's now 22. We always go to any building in Europe that has a ramp. Greta checks them out, does an audit of them. This is very, very steep, is it? I'm not very good at remembering names. It's the Corbusiers at Villa Savoie, the one that is basically ramps. And it's brilliant, but very steep. But it is, I guess, it's a very different way of moving around space. And then the spaces that come off those because of it. We also think a lot about kind of sensory environments. The Biennale is always a brilliant place in the Arsenale, particularly, which is a long series of warehouses with lots of either art or architecture installations. And I think having Greta as part of our family has just heightened our awareness that all the senses are really important, and looking for places that she reacts to, that she engages. Also thinking that spaces don't need to be about rooms. I mean, this is Ronchamp, and it's outside, and it's got, I mean, obviously everyone thinks about it as a form and then the insides of it, but actually there's lots of articulation along the facade, along the elevations of Ronchamp, which make spaces that people can occupy and feel differently in. So I'm kind of constantly observing to see when things like that happen. I think there's something about when children move through and occupy spaces that where there's a difference, and obviously with Greta, she has a different way of doing that, but we look for opportunities. The Thomas Heatherwick spin chair is a brilliant one because it allows her to go upside down and then come back round, assisted obviously. And I'm interested in kind of creativity of how children use these spaces. So finding moments in buildings
that include rather than exclude. I mean, it's a slightly, I have this slide, I've had this slide for a while, and I'm always slightly nervous about putting it on because obviously it's reliant on somebody lifting Greta out of her wheelchair in order to experience it. It would be far better if it had been designed so that wheelchairs, I think skateboarders use it actually. So this is Educatorum Remcourt House. It's at the back of the lecture theatre, so when all the students come out they can, so it's basically floor, wall, ceiling is all one kind of surface, but actually taking that idea and doing a more inclusive one that could be used by lots of people who wheel. Over the last 15 years I've run lots of creative workshops with children and young people around different themes and projects, and one of my favourites is always den building, because children have this kind of instinctive thing of wanting to make a space around themselves that is child-sized. I think when we observe that happening, it happens with kind of everyday objects often, and thinking as architects and designers how we can start to design spaces like that into our architectures. Including children in creative workshops from very young means that they actually start to think of the built environment around themselves and how they can affect it, how they can change it. Yeah, so some of the creative workshops I've done kind of start with the children or young people kind of assuming a character. These characters are often toys. They often are either wheels or springs or wind up tools, so they've already got a different way of moving around. So it's already getting children and young people to think that not everyone necessarily puts one foot in front of another and moves in the same way. And then kind of thinking about what kind of spaces these characters might want. So that's just a kind of, I guess that's a compendium. And then yeah, they kind of become these characters, and then they start to build spaces, either very big constructions, just cardboard boxes always work really well, or kind of smaller, more focused ones. So I think if we think about using this creativity in the design process, and using models to understand and change and create, I think models are much more accessible than drawings often. We often use them with our clients, with our adult clients as well, but I think there's a possibility of kind of understanding and being able to change space as well, three-dimensionally with models, where you can tear things off and add things in. And I think that it allows people to imagine themselves in those spaces in a way that drawings are problematic for. So talking about the design of the ramp house, which we did as a family, the four of us, and we kind of did a creative writing of the brief. So we thought about what do we enjoy doing, what do we need to do, what do we like to do together, what do we like to do separately, what characteristics of space do we want in our ramp house, rather than saying we need 3 bedrooms, we need a kitchen, we need a living room. We have very few doors. Well, we've got lots of external doors because there's lots of outdoor spaces on the different levels around that come off the ramp, but internally we have very few doors, except where spaces need to be private, so the bathroom and the bedrooms do. We kind of, our thought was, and we were really lucky to find a site right in the middle of an urban block in Portobello, which was a community that Greta had already grown up in, which again is a really key thing, I think, for a kind of feeling yourself as a part of an included part of a community. And so the first thing we did when we found the site was we worked out whether we could design a ramp to fit onto it. And then having designed the ramp to fit onto it, we then designed the spaces off the ramp that connected through. So that drawing just shows that. This here is a large-scale model. I think it was on Terrier 20, can't actually remember. It's been destroyed by the cats. However, it was a lovely model because we kind of made it just before we went on site and started building. And we had one session where we all sat around and we wrote in what we thought would happen in each of the spaces. So we each took spaces and wrote and layered over each other's as well. And obviously Greta was included in this, and it was very interesting before we started building and before we moved in to see what people thought they might do. Very good to revisit it now and see how we use those spaces, because I think there's been a lot of change, and occupancy of a space, I think particularly when you're the designer and the owner, leads to quite a lot of change. So yeah, this is just one of the things we do in our practice, and I think we had it was a privilege to be both the clients and the designers. It led to a very different process than the one that we usually have, and this was actually the first project that we designed together, but it meant lots of conversations around the kitchen table. And I think the actual process of building is one that also makes you think differently about space. So we happen to live 2 minutes away from where our site was, so we were there every day pretty much. I don't know what the builder felt about that. No, we've got on very well with them. And then one of the first things we did was kind of lay it out with flour to see what it was going to be like. And obviously we know from building sites that things change, whether that, at each of the different stages they get bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller, and then eventually the client's like, okay, it's about the size I thought it was going to be rather than tiny or massive. Obviously there's a steel structure in the ramp house because the ramp goes all the way through, it cuts through all of the structural lines, so we needed something that was going to allow for that to happen. And I think that's also led to far more connections, which I will talk about in a minute. That was just testing the ramp because everyone said our ramp would be too steep, so we got Greta to test before we built it, obviously, and it's fine. It works well for it. We've actually had lots and lots of different people in the house as we did Doors Open Day, and we now do Art Walk Quality, so lots of people come to the house, but particularly Doors Open Day, there were a lot of people who moved differently, whether it was like little kids that had the Lizzie Bug kind of wheelchairs that go up and down, where they kind of use the joystick, or there were a couple of people who had very strong upper body muscle and they loved it because it's quite steep, so actually using their wheelchair to do that. So lots of different experiences of it. I'm going to show you just some images of the finished house. I think it's tricky actually. I mean, I love our photographer, and I do love the images, although it's really colourful now. It looks completely different. But I think you kind of need to come to it and move through it to really understand it. If anyone's ever in Portobello, usually if people knock on my door, I will say, come in. We have had that happen quite a lot. We're down the end of a lane, so you see people kind of coming and looking at the building. But anyway, I think that these are kind of helpful, and I think what I'm going to do as I flick through them is I'm going to read little paragraphs from, and it's not called Doing Disability Differently, is it the reader? What's the reader that we had the chapter in, Joss? I keep calling it Doing Disability Differently.
Disability Space Architecture Reader.
Thank you very much, yeah, but it's the one that Joss edited, and Katie and I worked on the chapter together, and it was really looking at how the ramp house had become something more than just a wheelchair accessible home. So if I read out some of the blurb from that one, look at these images. Am I doing okay for time? I don't know if anyone knows or okay, that's right. I switched my watch on. Right. Okay, the principle of the ramp house was to design and build a family home for a little girl who was a wheelchair user, where the whole house enables her to lead a barrier-free, inclusive life. We are often confronted with the physical barriers that the built environment presents. In our own home, we were able to design a fully inclusive place, using a ramp to access all levels, provides an equality of space to us all. We've designed spaces along the ramp, connecting both horizontally and vertically, so that the experience of the house changes as it unfolds. As we inhabit the house, we can see how this provides variation, complexity, and flexibility in the everyday use of the house, how many spaces can be used concurrently, and how it reaches its potential when it is inhabited. Movement around it by foot or on wheels brings the experience to life. For us as a family, the design of this house made a difference to our everyday life. For a child who cannot move around independently, the connectivity of the spaces becomes all the more important. If Greta's in the living room, there are 6 different spaces, which is kind of the living room's this space here that we're standing in for that photo. There are 6 different spaces that we can be in and move between, and she's still able to see and hear us and communicate with us. Because of the articulation of the different spaces within the open plan, there are many opportunities for privacy and seclusion while still being part of the life of the house. Making the experience of a disabled child the starting point of a design process transforms the way she and the family live and opens up potential rather than limiting expectations. The house physically embodies an alternative spatial experience. For visitors moving through and around, it challenges their own perceptions of disability as they too use space differently. Importantly too, the designing, building and inhabiting of the house has opened up new possibilities for catalysing and including wider communities, even transforming social relations. For local people who participated in making the building happen, and for support workers, friends and relatives who use it with the family. So our house really has become quite a kind of hub where there's a huge amount of kind of coming and going some of the time, not all the time, but that's possible because it feels like it's an environment that has been designed by and with Greta at the centre of it, and that makes that very possible. But what I love about it is it doesn't feel like she has to be there because everywhere else is too difficult for her. It's more, this is a place where people can come and learn how to do things differently. Okay, so yeah, thinking about children using the built space as different experience of the ramp house. Accessible space can be about more than getting around without obstacles. It is also about making spaces that invite access and encourage new perceptions of how space can be used. For support workers, carers, friends and visitors, the ramp house can alter perceptions of what a disabled person can do, replacing limitations and practicalities with possibilities and dreams. And it's been crucial to us that we remain in the centre of our community where Greta was born. Building this house here has enabled her to remain a loved part of Portobello. Our accessible family home allows her friends to come and play in a built environment designed to enable her to play just like any other 8-year-old. I obviously wrote this a while ago because she's 19 now. The wider impact of an inclusive house like this is that people who come to visit us experience a different way of moving around a house and understand that accessibility does not need to be about constrictions, but can be a delight. So that's, yeah. So if I've got time, I'm going to talk a little bit about our design process with Thea. Have I got time? If no one's telling me I don't, then I have time. Excellent. So when we design, we're always thinking, well, whose viewpoint is it? So the design process for the Yard Dundee, we ran a series of inclusive creative workshops for the Yard Dundee, which is going to be a creative and adventurous outdoor, indoor play centre for children with disabilities, their families and their friends. There was kind of creative brief writing, which started with observing and listening. So this is a group of families already using an existing building, and we spent time getting to know them, observing how they play and use their existing space, and also we engaged with different groups of children and young people who use the yard in Edinburgh. So there are 3 in Scotland, and it was to be a new build for the new one in Dundee. So children creating and using spaces in model workshops. I think given cardboard boxes, so these are 2. This photo should carry on. This tower is tall, it's up to the ceiling. I don't know why I've got the wrong photo there. But, so they were both given cardboard boxes, and the one boy flattened them all out and made this very structurally sound fort around himself, and then stayed inside the fort for quite a long time, most of the session. Whereas this girl stacked up, but she made sure that there was one that was openable at the bottom so that she could occupy that space. So so over a number of weeks, the children have developed the design, creating spaces, thinking about how they're used. This is so this girl used the Playmobil as characters who were in the yard in this play space, and she had long kind of scenarios and little playing out of things that were happening with conversations of how this new space that they had co-designed with us could actually work for them for playing in. This is not necessary. necessarily. But no, this is so you can see we basically worked on a really big model with kids and adapting them and kind of took their lead, absolutely, helped them a little bit just with some of the cutting, but also had discussions around them. And then as the designers, we kind of looked at that and thought about, well, what is it about these spaces that the children are enjoying? There's something that happens. Let me see what the next. That's probably this one's the better one. Maybe this one. Yeah, this is probably better. There's something about so the yard has lots of different children who are there for different reasons. They have quite a lot of neurodivergent children who are also all very different, obviously. But so some of them, the self-reported would kind of come dashing in and run straight through the existing building and straight to outside and get on the go-kart and being very active. There would be other children that would come that would be very, very anxious about going there, and even each week they would be anxious, so it wasn't being anxious about going for a first time, it was an anxiety about coming in. And so we thought it was really important to actually design different spaces. So I think this diagram was looking, and this one as well, is kind of looking at the idea that you might have little, much more contained, like the contained space that she's designed here, little contained spaces along the route to get you through the building to get to where the outside is. And then what was really nice was actually being able to, this is something that's just ready to go to planning, but because of COVID, where they basically had to focus on their families and supporting them in really difficult times, and just finances, it's kind of on hold at the moment. But what was lovely for us was to be able to kind of visualise for the children and young people who've done the workshops to start to visualise what the space might be like, and the thing we were talking about earlier about people being a part of something, and always drawing the people and the activity into anything that we communicate. That's slightly less interesting. That's just kind of a bit of a visualisation. So just the last bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about, come back to the ramp house and look at this kind of idea that we are now inhabiting this house, and the difference that it makes to Greta, but also the difference that she made to the process. So this is at one of her birthday parties, and you can see, so this is one of the original eye gazers. She's now got an iPad that has eye gaze on, which is much cooler because you get all the apps and everything, and she can basically control them all with her eyes. She's become a filmmaker. I don't have recent slides of her doing that, but if you look on YouTube, you can see that she's made some award-winning films that have been screened at the Film House in Edinburgh and at various Kingston International Film Festival. But this was very early days where she obviously wasn't controlling this is just my phone, but she and her sister moved around the ramp house, and Greta commented on what she thought about the spaces and talked about what she thought of them, and as we made a film, so this became like a soundtrack film, and that was shown at the Royal Scottish Academy, which was part of the architecture exhibition. It was quite funny because we hadn't actually tidied the house before the girls did the film. So we walked into this very grand kind of exhibition opening, and there's kind of that unmade beds on a TV screen on the wall. But it was very real of what the ramp house is to live in. I think this is probably quite a good place to stop. There's a couple more slides, but they're kind of off on a different thing, and you've already seen a bit from Greta. So I think having the person at the centre of the design process, as well as the spatial uses, and that she can now comment and record the spaces. So quite often now the ramp house is a location for her short films, and there's a kind of interactivity that comes from designing something, co-designing something together, but then also living there. And the experience of, maybe it's about the fact that she's really representing it now to the world with her. She's always in her filmmaking, she's always a protagonist. She always wants to be in front of the camera as well as being the director. And I think there's something there about changing people's perceptions. I've realised I did have places for all of the terms. They do all fit, and I've just completely forgotten. But you could maybe kind of make the connections. We can talk about it a little bit. But yeah, I think that's probably a good place to stop.
Great.